The storm rolled in just before dusk, swallowing the sky in thick, restless clouds. Out on the open plains, Caleb Turner leaned against the wooden fence of his ranch, watching the wind bend the tall grass like waves in a troubled sea. He had seen storms like this before, sudden, heavy, and merciless in sound if not in consequence. Still, something about this one felt different. Quieter, almost watchful. By the time the first drops of rain began to fall, Caleb had already made his way back toward the house. The ranch was silent except for the distant rumble of thunder and the creak of old wood under pressure. It had been silent for a long time now, too long, inside. The house carried the kind of stillness that came from years of living alone. A single lamp lit the main room, casting soft golden light over worn furniture and faded photographs that hadn't been moved in years. Caleb hung his coat by the door and paused for a moment, his eyes drifting like they always did to the picture. Frame on the mantel? He didn't pick it up. He never did any more. Another crack of thunder broke the quiet, sharper this time. Then came something else. A knock. Caleb froze. Out here, no one knocked after dark. Neighbors lived miles away, and no traveler would wander this far without reason. For a brief moment he wondered if he had imagined it, but then it came again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. He stepped toward the door cautiously, his boots heavy against the wooden floor. When he opened it, the wind pushed hard against him, carrying rain and cold air inside, and there she stood, a woman, drenched from head to toe, her figure partially hidden beneath a long, dark coat. But what caught Caleb's attention wasn't the rain or the trembling in her posture. It was the veil. A thin, pale fabric covered her face completely, clinging slightly from the rain. It wasn't torn or makeshift, it looked intentional. Careful. Unusual. Double quotes, please, she said, her voice soft but steady despite the storm. I'm sorry to come like this. I just need a place to stay for the night. Caleb hesitated, not out of fear but uncertainty. Nothing about this felt ordinary. Still, there was something in her voice. Not desperation. Not quite. Something quieter. Like someone who had already been turned away too many times. You're a long way from town. He said, I know, she replied gently. Thunder rolled again, closer now. The wind picked up, tugging at the edges of her coat. For a moment, it looked like she might lose her balance. That was enough. Caleb stepped aside. Come in before the storm gets worse. She didn't move right away. Instead, she lowered her head slightly, almost as if bracing herself. There's something you should know first, she said. Caleb frowned faintly. All right. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of her coat. If I stay, she continued, you can't ask me to remove this. She gestured lightly toward the veil. No matter what happens? No questions. No exceptions. The request hung in the air between them, strange and heavy. Caleb studied her for a moment. There were 100 questions forming in his mind, but none of them felt right to ask. Not now. Not when she stood there in the cold, asking for nothing more than a roof for the night. Is someone looking for you? He asked instead. She shook her head. Are you in trouble? A pause. No, she said quietly. Another silence stretched between them. The storm filled it, loud and insistent. Finally, Caleb exhaled. You can stay, he said. I don't need answers tonight. For the first time, her shoulders seemed to ease. Thank you. She stepped inside carefully, as if crossing an invisible line. Caleb closed the door behind her, shutting out the storm, but not the feeling it had brought with it. He offered her a towel, then pointed toward the small guest room down the hall. You can dry off in there. I'll start a fire. She nodded, her movements gentle, almost cautious. As she passed him, he caught a faint scent of rain and something else, something unfamiliar, like old paper or distant memories before she disappeared down the hallway. She stopped. You're kind, she said softly, without turning around. More than you should be. Caleb didn't respond. He wasn't sure how, a moment later, the door to the guest room closed quietly, left alone. Caleb stood still in the center of the room, listening to the storm rage outside and to the quiet, unsettling shift inside his home. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone anymore, and somehow that felt more unsettling than the storm itself. Morning arrived slowly, As if the storm had taken part of the sky with it, Caleb woke to an unfamiliar sound-soft movement in the kitchen. For a moment he lay still, staring at the ceiling, trying to place it. It had been years since anyone else had been inside the house long. Enough to make noise at dawn? Then he remembered the woman Eliza. He sat up, running a hand through his hair, the events of the previous night settling back into place. The storm, the knock, the veil, and the condition. No questions. Caleb stepped out of his room and followed the faint clink of dishes. When he reached the doorway of the kitchen, he stopped. She stood by the window, sunlight filtering in through the thin curtains behind her. The storm had passed, leaving everything washed clean and quiet. Eliza had changed into a simple dress he must have left behind years ago, one that didn't quite belong to her, but she wore it carefully. Respectfully, the veil was still there. Dry now, smoother, but just as deliberate. "I hope you don't mind," she said softly, noticing him. "I found some eggs and thought I could make breakfast." Caleb blinked, slightly caught off guard. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," she replied. "It's the least I can offer." There was no awkwardness in her tone, only a calm sense of purpose. She moved around the kitchen like she had been there before, though Caleb knew she hadn't. Not really. He stepped inside, leaning lightly against the doorframe. "Most people just take the bed and leave before sunrise." A faint pause. Then, almost gently, she said, "I'm not most people." Caleb let out a quiet breath. Something close to a half-smile forming before he could stop it. I guess not. They ate together in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. The kind that comes when two people don't yet know what to ask, or what they're allowed to know. Caleb found himself watching her without meaning to. The way she held her cup, careful and steady. The way she tilted her head slightly when listening. Everything about her felt intentional, as if she had learned to exist in a way that took up as little space as possible. "Do you have somewhere to go?" he asked eventually. Eliza's hands paused around the edge of her cup. "I did," she said after a moment. "But plans change. That sounds complicated." "It is." Another pause. Caleb nodded slowly. He wasn't going to press. Not after what she'd asked of him the night before. Still, something about her presence lingered in the room, not heavy, not intrusive. Just there. Like a question that didn't need words. "You can stay a few days," he said, surprising even himself. "Until you figure things out?" Eliza looked up at him, the veil hiding her expression, but something in her posture shifted. Not quite relief. Not quite hesitation. "You don't know anything about me," she said quietly. Caleb shrugged. "I know you showed up in the middle of a storm and asked for shelter instead of taking it. That's enough for now." A long silence followed. Then, softly, almost carefully, she said, "All right." And just like that, the arrangement began. The days settled into a rhythm neither of them spoke about. But both seemed to understand. Eliza helped around the ranch without being asked. She mended torn fabric, cleaned spaces Caleb hadn't touched in years, and somehow brought life back into routines that had grown dull with time. She worked quietly, never drawing attention to herself, but the difference she made was impossible to ignore. Caleb noticed it. Most in the evenings. The house didn't feel as empty. One afternoon, while repairing a section of fence, Caleb caught sight of her standing at a distance, watching the open fields. The wind moved gently around her, tugging at the edges of her dress, but the veil stayed perfectly in place. He walked over slowly. "You ever worked on a ranch before?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, you're picking it up fast." "I've had to learn things quickly," she replied. There was something in her voice, something practiced. Not defensive, just true. Caleb rested his arms on the fence post beside her. "You always wear it?" He regretted the question the moment it left his mouth. Eliza didn't turn toward him. For a few seconds she didn't move at all. Double quotes, "Yes," she said. The single word carried more weight than he expected. "I'm sorry," Caleb added quietly. "I said I wouldn't ask." "You didn't ask why?" she replied. "Just if." That didn't make it better. Still, she didn't walk away. Instead, she stood there beside him. Both of them looking out over the same stretch of land, two strangers sharing the same silence. After a moment, she spoke again. Some things, she said gently, are easier to carry when they're not seen. Caleb didn't respond, but the words stayed with him that night. As the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows filled the corners of the house, Caleb found himself noticing something he hadn't felt in a long time. Curiosity, not the restless kind, but the quiet, steady kind that grows when something doesn't quite make sense and yet feels important. Eliza was a mystery, but she wasn't a threat, and somehow that made it harder, not easier, to keep. By the end of the week, the ranch no longer felt like Caleb's alone. It wasn't just the extra pair of footsteps or the quiet hum of activity that filled the spaces between sunrise and dusk. It was something less tangible, something that lingered in the air, like a memory trying to return but not quite finding its shape. Eliza moved through the days with a quiet rhythm. She spoke when needed, worked without being asked, and somehow managed to restore life to corners of the house Caleb had long forgotten. The old curtains had been washed, the shelves cleared. Even the small porch out front, once layered in dust and disuse, now looked like a place meant to be sat in again. Still, the veil never left her face, not once, and people had started to notice. Caleb rarely went into town, but supplies didn't fetch themselves. So one morning he hitched the truck and made a long drive down the winding dirt road that led to the small general store. The bell above the door gave its usual soft chime as he stepped inside. "Caleb." "Turner," came a familiar voice from behind the counter. "Thought you'd forgotten we exist out here." Caleb gave a small nod. "Just keeping busy, Martha." Martha, the store owner, crossed her arms with a knowing look. "Busy enough to bring company, from what I hear." Caleb paused mid-step. "News travels fast," he muttered. "In a place this small?" "Faster than the wind," she said, leaning forward slightly. "So, you gotta tell me about her?" "There's nothing to tell." Martha raised an eyebrow. "A woman shows up at your ranch in the middle of nowhere, keeps her face covered, and suddenly your place looks like someone remembered how to live there again, and there's nothing to tell?" Caleb grabbed a few items off the shelf, avoiding her gaze. She needed a place to stay. "That's it? And the veil?" He didn't answer right away. Martha's voice softened just a little. "People are talking, Caleb. You know how that goes." "I do," he said, setting the items down on the counter. "That's why I'm not adding to it." Martha studied him for a moment, then sighed. "Fair enough. But be careful. Not everything that shows up in a storm leaves quietly." Caleb met her eyes, then not defensive, just steady. "She's not trouble." Martha didn't argue, but she didn't look convinced either. When Caleb returned to the ranch later that afternoon, he found Eliza near the edge of the property, standing beneath the shade of a tall tree. The sunlight filtered through the leaves above her, casting shifting patterns across her dress. She was perfectly still, watching something, or maybe remembering. "You all right?" he called out as he approached. She turned slightly at the sound of his voice. "Yes." Caleb followed her gaze out across the open land. "You've been out here a while." "I like the quiet," she said. He nodded. "Most people don't, not this kind." "It's different when you're used to noise," she replied. "Silence feels honest." There was that word again, careful, thoughtful. Like every sentence she spoke had already been weighed before it was given. Caleb shifted his weight. "Town's talking." Eliza didn't react right away, then, softly, "About me?" "About the veil." A small pause. "I figured they would." "You don't seem surprised." "I've learned not to be," she said gently. Caleb glanced at her, trying again not to stare at the thin fabric separating her from the world. "Does it bother you?" She considered the question, not as much as it used to. That answer stayed with him. Over the next few days, Caleb began to notice more, not big things, nothing obvious. Just small, quiet details that didn't quite fit together. Eliza avoided mirrors, completely, one afternoon. While cleaning, she carefully turned a framed photograph on the wall to face downward before passing it, only turning it back once she was done. When Caleb asked about it, she simply said the light had been reflecting strangely. Another time, he saw her flinch, not at a loud noise, but at something softer. the distant echo of laughter carried by the wind from a neighboring ranch. It was gone as quickly as it came, but Caleb had seen it. And then there was the light Eliza preferred. Shadows. She didn't refuse sunlight, but she never stood fully in it either. Always just at the edge, where brightness softened into something gentler. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but it wasn't nothing. Either. One evening, as the sky turned deep shades of orange and gold, Caleb found her sitting on the porch steps, her hands folded neatly in her lap. He joined her without a word. For a while, they just sat there, watching the horizon fade. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked after a while. Eliza tilted her head slightly. "Leaving where?" "Anywhere." A pause. "I used to," she said. Before what?" The question slipped out before he could stop it. Eliza's fingers tightened slightly, just for a second, then relaxed. "Before I realized some things follow you," she said quietly. "No matter how far you go?" Caleb leaned back against the wooden post behind him, exhaling slowly. "Sounds heavy." "It can be," she admitted. Another silence settled between them, this one deeper, but not uncomfortable. Caleb glanced at her again, curiosity pressing gently at the edges of his restraint. He had kept his promise. He hadn't asked her to remove the veil, but the questions, they were growing. And for the first time, he wasn't sure how long he could keep them to himself. The days stretched longer, warmer, and softer than Caleb remembered them ever being. Spring had begun to settle over the land, brushing the fields with faint green and filling the air with a calm he hadn't felt in years. But the change wasn't just in the season. It was in the house. It was in him, and somehow it was in her. Eliza had become part of the rhythm of the ranch in a way that felt both natural and unexpected. She woke early, often before Caleb, and by the time he stepped outside, something was already in motion. Coffee brewed, tools set aside, small tasks handled, without a word. But it wasn't just what she did. It was how she did it. There was a quiet care in everything, like she wasn't just fixing things, but restoring them, giving attention to details most people would overlook. A loose hinge, a cracked window latch, even the old rocking chair on the porch, which hadn't been touched in years, now moved smoothly again, as if it had been waiting. Caleb noticed all of it, even the things she thought he wouldn't. One afternoon, while repairing a section of the barn roof, Caleb misjudged his footing slightly. It wasn't a dangerous slip, but enough to throw him off balance for a second. "Eliza," he started, more out of instinct than need. Before he could even steady himself, she was already there below, looking up. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice calm but alert. Caleb let out a small breath, regaining his stance. "Yeah, just missed a step." She didn't move right away. Instead, she stayed where she was, watching him not anxiously, but carefully, like she needed to be certain. "I can finish that side if you want," she offered. Caleb shook his head with a faint smile. "I think I've got it." A pause, then almost quietly she said, "You don't always have to do everything alone." The words landed deeper than he expected. For a moment, Caleb didn't respond. He just looked down at her, really looked this time, beyond the veil, beyond the mystery. There was no pressure in her voice. Just understanding. "I know," he said finally. "Just been doing it that way for a while." Eliza nodded, as if that explained everything. Maybe it did. Later that evening, the two of them sat on the porch as the sun began its slow descent. The sky stretched wide and open, painted in soft shades of gold and rose. Eliza sat in the rocking chair she had repaired, her movements gentle, steady. Caleb leaned against the railing, arms folded loosely, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "You ever miss it?" she asked after a while. Caleb glanced at her. "Miss what?" "Having more people around," she said. "A full house." He let out a quiet breath, the question catching him off guard. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Other times, I think I just got used to the quiet." Eliza tilted her head slightly. "And now?" Caleb hesitated. Now wasn't quiet anymore, not in the same way. "It's different," he said. She didn't press further, but something in the space between them shifted, subtle, but real. As the days passed, their conversations grew longer. Not frequent, not overwhelming, but deeper. They spoke about simple things at first. The land, the weather. Small stories from years gone by. Then slowly, pieces of something more began to surface. Eliza spoke about places she had been but never stayed long enough to belong to. She described cities in careful detail, always from the perspective of someone watching rather than living. Caleb shared stories about the ranch, about growing up there, about how things used to be before the silence settled in, but there were still boundaries, invisible lines neither of them crossed. He didn't ask about the veil, and she didn't explain it. One afternoon, while sorting through a box of old belongings in the living room, Caleb found something he hadn't seen in years, a photograph. He paused, holding it in his hands. The edges were worn, the colors slightly faded, but the image was still clear. Eliza noticed. "What is it?" she asked softly. Caleb hesitated for a moment, then turned the photo slightly, just enough for her to see. "It's from a long time ago," he said. Eliza leaned closer, but not too close. "Never too close? And her?" she asked gently. Caleb looked back at the photograph. For a moment he didn't answer. Then, quietly, "Someone I used to know?" Eliza didn't respond right away. Instead, she straightened slowly, her hands folding together again. "You don't talk about her much," she said. Caleb gave a small, almost distant smile. "Not much to say anymore." Another silence, but this one felt different. Heavier. Not uncomfortable, but closer to something. The ranch had changed in ways Caleb could no longer ignore. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle, like sunlight shifting its angle over time until you realized the room you once knew is no longer the same. Eliza was still Eliza, and yet something about her presence had begun to press against the edges of his thoughts. Not in fear. In curiosity, and something more dangerous than both. Attachment. That morning started like any other. Coffee on the stove. Soft footsteps in the hallway. The faint creak of the porch as Eliza stepped outside before him, as she often did. As if she belonged to the early hours more than the rest of the day, Caleb followed her out, leaning against the doorframe for a moment before speaking. "You don't sleep much, do you?" he asked. Eliza didn't turn right away. She was looking at the fields, hands resting lightly on the porch railing. "I sleep," she said, "just not deeply." "That doesn't sound like much rest." "It's enough." Caleb studied her quietly. The veil moved slightly in the morning breeze, but never shifted enough to reveal anything beneath it. Never enough. And yet, he found himself noticing the smallest things now. The way she paused before answering certain questions. The way she avoided reflective surfaces without acknowledging it. The way her posture changed when silence stretched too long. He used to think it was just privacy. Now he wasn't so sure. It wasn't until later that day that everything began to tilt. They were inside, sorting through old storage boxes in the barn. Dust floated in thin streaks of light filtering through the wooden slats above. It was ordinary work, quiet, simple, familiar, until it wasn't. Caleb reached into a box and pulled out a folded cloth. It was old, worn at the edges, but carefully preserved. He didn't recognize it at first. Eliza did, the moment her gaze landed on it. Something changed. Not dramatically, but instantly. Her movement slowed. Her hands paused mid-motion. And for the first time since she had arrived, she stepped backward instead of forward. "Don't open that," she said softly. Caleb looked at her. "It's just fabric." Her voice tightened slightly. "Please." That word "please" was different this time. Not polite, not casual, urgent. Caleb hesitated. Then, gently, he set the cloth back down. "All right," he said. "I won't." Eliza exhaled slowly, as if she had been holding her breath without realizing it. Silence settled again. But it wasn't the same silence as before. It carried weight. Now. Later that evening, the shift continued. Eliza didn't join him on the porch. That alone was unusual. Caleb found her instead, standing near the edge of the property, where the land sloped gently toward the open fields. She wasn't doing anything, just standing there, still as the wind moved around her. He walked toward her slowly. "You all right?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately. When she finally spoke, Her voice was quieter than usual. Have you ever felt like you're borrowing your own life? Caleb frowned slightly. What do you mean? Eliza's hands tightened lightly at her sides. Like you're walking through something that isn't fully yours, she said. Like if someone looked closely enough, they'd realize you don't belong where you are. Caleb didn't respond right away. The question didn't make sense in a simple way, but emotionally, it did. I think everyone feels like that sometimes, he said carefully. Eliza shook her head slightly. Not like this. A pause. Then, softer. Not when you're hiding something every single day. The words lingered between them. Caleb stepped closer. Just enough that his voice didn't have to carry. You don't have to stay if you don't want to, he said. Eliza turned slightly toward him. For a moment, he thought she might say yes or no, but she didn't. Instead, she said, that's not the problem. The tension didn't explode. It settled. Heavier. Deeper. That night, neither of them spoke much at dinner. The usual rhythm between them, broken but comfortable, was gone. In its place was something careful, measured, like both were trying not to touch a wound they couldn't see afterward. Eliza stood near the hallway instead of sitting with him. I should go rest, she said quietly. Caleb nodded. All right. She hesitated. Then added, almost like it cost her something to say it, thank you for not asking. Caleb met her gaze. I said I wouldn't, he reminded her gently. I know, she replied, but she didn't move right away. Instead, she stood there for a moment longer, as if something inside her was leaning towards saying more. Then she turned and walked down the hallway. Caleb stayed in the living room. Long after the house grew quiet, the fire had burned down to soft embers. Shadows stretched across the floor in slow, uneven patterns. Outside, the ranch was silent again, but his thoughts weren't. They circled back to her words, borrowing. Your own life, not belonging, hiding something. Every day, he realized something, then something he hadn't been ready to admit. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It wasn't just concern. It was need, the need to understand, to know, to finally close the distance between what she showed and what she refused to reveal. Caleb stood slowly, looking down the hallway where her door remained closed. The promise he had made still held. The promises, he realized, didn't always protect the truth. Sometimes they only delayed it. And tonight, for the first time, he wasn't sure how much longer he could wait. The ranch was quiet again, but not the peaceful kind of quiet Caleb had grown used to. This was the kind that listened back. Every creak of the wood, every shift of wind through the fields felt sharper now, as if the land itself had become aware of what was unspoken inside the house. Eliza kept to herself more that morning, not distant exactly, just careful. Careful in the way she moved through the kitchen. Careful in the way she avoided staying in one place too long. Careful in the way she answered questions that hadn't even been asked yet. Caleb noticed. He always noticed now. But he didn't push. Not yet. By midday, the sound of an engine broke the stillness. A truck. Not Caleb's. He stepped out onto the porch, just as dust rolled up from the dirt road leading to the ranch. A lone vehicle came into view, slow and steady, like it wasn't entirely sure it belonged there. Eliza appeared behind him almost instantly. She didn't ask what it was. She already knew something had changed. The truck stopped near the fence line. A man stepped out, middle-aged, carrying a worn satchel and the tired posture of someone who had spent too many hours traveling alone. He raised a hand in greeting. Afternoon, he called. Caleb stepped forward slightly. You lost? The man gave a small, polite smile. Not lost. Passing through. I'm Dr. Harlan. That name didn't mean anything at first. Until it did. Eliza shifted behind Caleb barely, but noticeably, not fear. Recognition. The doctor's gaze moved briefly across the ranch, then settled on Caleb again. I was told this was Turner property, he said. Figured I'd stop by. I don't often come this way anymore. Caleb nodded cautiously. What do you need, doctor? Before the man could answer, his eyes flicked just slightly past Caleb. To Eliza. And something in his expression changed. Not shock, not surprise. Something more subtle, recognition. That didn't belong to this Moment. Eliza stepped back half a pace, just enough. The doctor cleared his throat lightly. I don't mean to intrude, he said carefully, but I've been traveling through the region assisting patients from earlier years, people who had reconstructive procedures after accidents. Rare cases. Caleb frowned slightly. And you think that relates to us how? The man hesitated, then looked directly at Eliza. I think I know. You, he said gently. Silence fell, not loud, not dramatic. Just immediate. Eliza didn't speak, didn't move, but Caleb felt it, the shift in the air behind him. Like something had tightened without sound. The doctor continued carefully, almost apologetically. There was a facility I consulted with years ago. Experimental facial reconstruction work. Very limited cases. Most records were sealed or reassigned. Caleb slowly turned his head slightly toward Eliza. She still hadn't spoken. Some of the patients, the doctor added, were matched using reference imaging. Old photographs. Family records. In rare situations, resemblance outcomes were unintentionally strong. Caleb's throat tightened slightly. What are you saying? The doctor hesitated again, then said it plainly. I'm saying I've seen a face like yours before, he said, looking at Eliza, but not as you are now. As someone else. The world didn't change, but something inside it. Did Eliza finally spoke, but barely above a whisper. Please don't. The words weren't directed at the doctor, they were directed at the moment itself. At what was being uncovered. Caleb turned fully. Now, for the first time since she arrived, he looked at her not as someone passing through his life, but as someone whose life might not be what it seemed. Eliza, he said quietly, is that true? She didn't answer immediately, and that silence said more than anything else had so far. The doctor shifted uncomfortably. I may have said too much, he admitted. I apologize. I shouldn't have assumed. It's fine. Caleb interrupted, but his voice didn't sound fine. It sounded distant. Controlled. Like something inside him was holding itself together by force. The doctor eventually left. There was no resolution. No explanation completed. Just polite departure and the soft crunch of tires fading back down the dirt road, but nothing returned to normal with him. Not for anyone. Inside the house, Eliza stood near the kitchen table, her hands resting lightly on the edge as if she needed something stable beneath her. Caleb stayed near the doorway. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, he did. You were going to tell me, he said. It wasn't an accusation. Just a realization. Elisa lowered her head slightly. It's not simple. Nothing ever is. The house felt different after the doctor left. Not physically, nothing had moved. Nothing had changed, but the air itself seemed rearranged. Like a room after a secret has been spoken aloud for the first time. Everything still existed, but nothing felt untouched anymore. Caleb sat alone at the kitchen table long after Eliza had gone quiet in the guest room. Or at least, he assumed she had. The truth was, he couldn't tell what she was doing anymore. That was the problem. For days, he had lived beside her presence, shared meals, conversations, silences, yet now it felt like he had been standing beside a closed door the entire time, believing it was open, and the key had been there all along. Just out of reach, night settled over the ranch slowly, pressing darkness against the windows. The wind outside had picked up again, brushing against the house like a restless thought that wouldn't go away. Caleb stood in the hallway. Still. Listening. The guest room door was closed. No sound came from inside. He told himself to walk away. To give it time. To respect the promise, but promises only mattered when you still understood what you were protecting, and Caleb didn't know that anymore. He reached for the door handle once, then stopped. His hand hovered there, frozen between restraint and certainty. Eliza, he said quietly. No answer, only silence. That silence should have been enough, but it wasn't. Caleb exhaled slowly, almost like he was letting go of something he'd been holding for too long. Then he opened the door. The room was dim, lit only by the faint glow of a lamp left on low. Everything was still. Too still. Eliza was asleep on the bed, or at least, she appeared to be. Caleb stood in the doorway for a long moment, unsure if he should step forward. The air felt heavier inside the room, as if even the space itself was waiting. His eyes moved to her face, the veil. It was still there, carefully placed. Deliberate. Like a final boundary drawn even in sleep. Caleb's breath slowed. He took one step forward, then another. I promised I wouldn't ask, he whispered, not to her, but to himself. He knelt beside the bed, his hand hovered above the fabric. For a moment, everything in him resisted the memory of her voice, her hesitation, her fear, but beneath all of it now was something else. Not curiosity anymore. Understanding. Or the need for it. Slowly, carefully, he touched the edge of the veil. Eliza didn't move. Caleb hesitated one last time. Then gently lifted it. Nothing happened. No sound. No reaction. Just stillness. And then the truth. Her face was not what he expected, not damaged, not hidden in fear, not broken. It was calm, strikingly human, but there was something else. Something familiar in a way that made his chest tighten. Immediately. Not because it was frightening, because it was impossible. Caleb's breath caught. His mind searched instantly, fast, desperate for explanation, and found one. A memory. A photograph. The mantle. Years ago. Someone he had lost. Someone he had stopped saying out loud. The resemblance wasn't close. It was precise, too. Precise, like time had folded in on itself and placed memory into reality without permission. No, Caleb whispered. Barely audible. Eliza stirred slightly. Her eyes opened slowly, and the moment she saw him, she knew. There was no confusion, no surprise, only a quiet resignation, like she had always known this moment would come. You shouldn't have done that, she said softly. Caleb didn't move. He couldn't. His voice came out fractured. Who are you? Eliza sat up slowly, reaching instinctively for the veil but stopping halfway. Her hand fell back into her lap. I told you not to ask me to take it off, she said gently. That wasn't a question, Caleb replied, struggling to steady his breath. I need the truth. A long silence stretched between them. Then she spoke. I'm not her, Eliza said. Caleb closed his eyes briefly, as if trying to reset reality itself. I know what I saw, he said. I know what you think you saw. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't defend. It simply existed. Caleb shook his head slightly. That face... Eliza looked down for a moment. It was never meant to be that, she said quietly. It was the result of something I didn't choose. Caleb frowned. The doctor, he said, reconstruction. Yes, she said softly. A program, experimental. After an accident, I didn't have much left of who I was supposed to be. Her fingers tightened gently together. They used old references, she continued. Images, records, they rebuild what they could. But sometimes, what they rebuild isn't neutral. Caleb's voice dropped. They used her. Eliza didn't confirm it directly, but she didn't deny it either. The room felt smaller now, not because it had changed, but because truth had entered. Caleb stood slowly, stepping back from the bed. I don't understand, he said. You're not supposed to. Eliza replied. Another pause, then softer. I didn't come here to become her in your life. I came here because I needed to exist somewhere where I wasn't just a mistake made visible. Caleb looked at her for a long time, not with anger, not with fear, but something more complicated, something heavier, because the truth didn't destroy what he felt. It complicated it. And that was worse. You should have told me, he said finally. I tried, she whispered, in the only way I knew how. Silence followed again, but this time it wasn't empty. It was full of everything neither of them could take back. Caleb turned slightly toward the door, then stopped, without looking at her. He asked quietly, Then who are you? When no one is comparing you to someone else? Eliza didn't answer immediately, and in that pause, for the first time, there was no story left to hide behind, only the beginning of a truth neither of them had fully understood yet. The silence after her last words Didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a pause the world itself had forgotten how to break. Caleb stood near the doorway, one hand still resting on the frame as if it was the only thing keeping him anchored. Behind him, the hallway stretched into darkness. In front of him, Eliza sat on the bed, no longer hidden, no longer shielded by the veil that had defined every moment since she arrived. And yet, she looked more vulnerable now than she ever had before, not because she was exposed, but because she was finally seen. Minutes passed. Neither of them moved. Outside, the wind softened against the ranch, like even the storm had decided to listen instead of speak. Finally, Caleb exhaled. It wasn't sharp. It wasn't emotional. It was tired. I spent days trying not to ask, he said quietly. And now I don't know what I was protecting anymore. Eliza lowered her gaze slightly. You were protecting your memory. Caleb shook his head once. No, a pause, then, more honestly, I was protecting the idea that I still understood it. That landed differently. Not as blame, not as confession, but as recognition. Eliza stood slowly, as if testing whether the moment would allow it. She took one step forward, then stopped, not closing the distance, not forcing it. Just existing in it. I didn't come here to confuse your life, she said gently. I came here because I didn't have anywhere else where I could stop running from what I am. Caleb finally turned fully toward her. His voice was quieter now. And what are you? Eliza hesitated, not because she didn't know, but because the answer had too many layers to fit into words that wouldn't hurt. I'm someone who was rebuilt from pieces of a past that wasn't mine, she said. Someone who carries a face that belongs to a memory you never let go of. She paused, then added, softer, but I'm still me. The words hung between them. Caleb looked at her carefully now, not searching for resemblance anymore, not comparing, not trying to force meaning onto what he saw. Just looking, for the first time, not through memory. But through presence. You should have told me sooner, he said again, but without accusation. Eliza nodded slightly. I know. Another silence, this one longer. He stepped further into the room, not toward her, just into it. As if accepting the space she occupied instead of resisting it. You know what's strange? Caleb said after a moment. Eliza looked up slightly. I thought the hardest part would be seeing your face, he continued. But it wasn't. His voice softened. The hardest part is realizing I was never just seeing you. Eliza's expression shifted slightly. Not fear, not relief. Understanding. Caleb continued, carefully choosing each word. I saw what I lost. I saw what I never said. I saw time I can't get back. A pause. Then, quieter, and I put all of that on you without meaning to. Eliza took a slow breath, for the first time since she arrived. Her voice wasn't guarded. It wasn't just you, she said. I let it happen because it was easier than explaining I wasn't. Her. Caleb nodded faintly. No, that was the first time he had said it. Not questioned it. Not struggled against it. Just accepted the complexity of it. The room didn't feel like it belonged to confusion anymore. It belonged to something more. Fragile. Honesty. Caleb looked down for a moment, then spoke again. What happens now? Eliza didn't answer immediately because there was no script for this part. No rule for what comes after truth replaces illusion. I don't know, she said finally. I've spent so long trying not to be defined by what I look like. I forgot what happens when someone actually stays long enough to see past it. Caleb's gaze lifted slightly. That's not all I see, he said. Eliza met his eyes, then really met them. For the first time, without distance, without veil, without separation, the silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was open, like something unfinished, but not broken. Caleb stepped back slightly, giving space, not distance in rejection, but space in respect. I won't pretend this is simple, he said. Eliza nodded. It isn't. But I also won't pretend you're just a mistake someone made, he added. That made her still, completely still, a long